Dr. O'Rourke, welcome to the tribunal. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon.
For the record, can you give your name, the organisation that you're with, and the capacity that you're giving evidence before the tribunal in?
Sure. I'm Catherine O'Rourke. I'm a senior lecturer at Ulster University Law School, where I direct the Transitional Justice Institute, and I'm here in a personal capacity.
Thank you. And I know your expertise is transitional justice, but before we get into the meat of your witness statement, I just want to ask you a couple of other questions. And the first one is that we've heard today quite a lot about gender neutral policy in Northern Ireland, and I just want to know what your view is of the consequences of this policy.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is well documented. It's publicly documented that is the position of policymaking in Northern Ireland. It is, I think, really a travesty of the intention of the legislation it claims to implement, and likewise a travesty of the Good Friday Agreement. My own experience in terms of advocating for an improved interpretation of that legislation has been that whilst there are changes in politicians and political party fortunes, in fact, there's a very robust civil service commitment to that interpretation of the legislation, and that without really, I think, robust and public political commitment to a more transformative interpretation of the equality obligation, that is what we're left with. But I think it's very unfortunate that given the particular way in which Northern Ireland politics has run for the past 2 decades, that civil servants are the sort of constant story, and while the political fortunes change, they remain the same. So I think it would be incredibly valuable, really, if a clear message coming out of this tribunal was that what is happening is not in line with the either the spirit or, in fact, the text of our equality legislation, nor the intent of it.
Thank you. And aside from that, are there any specific positive gains that you could describe as having occurred in the past from CEDAW, or the existence of CEDAW?
Well, in Northern Ireland, it's I know we've heard already today about this, but certainly it's been transformative around the abortion legislation, abortion decriminalisation. The CEDAW committee's role has been, even I think by international standards, it is a remarkable success story that we are in a position of decriminalisation. The legislation, the Westminster legislation giving effect, specifically refers to recommendations from the CEDAW committee. It's been absolutely been change that I think we wouldn't have seen without that international pressure from the committee.
And thank you. And to just move on to your real specialism in okay. Post-conflict and gender, you describe there being, in your statement, there being 3 real issues, and I think this is at paragraph 4. The key issues being women's participation in decision-making, the cause of the conflict, and the peace agreement. And I just thought maybe we could take those 3 in turn and look at women's participation in decision-making first, and how you think that General Recommendation 30 might assist in the context of Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. When it comes to dealing with the conflict legacy, which General Recommendation 30 is very, very helpful and very prescriptive. The obstacles really to women's participation in this whole discussion are manifold. So first of all, we have a power sharing executive that gives precedence to ethnic categories rather than to gender categories. So decisions, well, as long as there is broad agreement between the Protestant and nationalist communities, then the impact on women isn't necessarily being considered. So there's a sort of a structural factor around our political decision making. I think more broadly then, when it comes to the conflict legacy issue, because of the gender demographics of the conflict deaths, so overwhelmingly it was men who lost their lives. And we've had a very, very legalised process of dealing with the past in Northern Ireland, so providing accountability for those deaths. What has called into view constantly has been about heavily legalised processes of accountability for those men in ways that has completely obscured the women who have borne the brunt of maintaining families and communities, whilst also continuing campaigns for accountability for several decades. So they've been sort of structurally invisibilized, I think, through the current approach. And then the final thing where I think that the gender piece becomes so apparent is the extent to which the institutions that are making decisions around dealing with the past, and the extent to which institutions that are engaged in the business of dealing with the past, so whether that be particular bodies of the police or the Office of the Police Ombudsman and other institutions, they are incredibly heavily male staffed. In fact, mostly the skill set that's really valued in that whole procedure is around police investigations. So gender is everywhere in this process, very much determining whether you are seeking justice or involved in delivering justice, but is entirely unacknowledged in the process at all, including in the most promising step we've had really around post-conflict legacy, which was the Stormont House Agreement in 2014, which did finally provide for agreed institutions on dealing with the past. Gender, however, again, is it's not only it's invisible, but it's absent. It's not mentioned at all. And just to bring that home, I suppose the CEDAW committee has specifically raised this issue around the Stormont House Agreement implementation and legislation, the lack of a gender perspective. They raised it in 2019 in their recommendations. Likewise, the Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, when he was in Northern Ireland, actually said Northern Ireland had distinguished itself by its lack of gender sensitivity, even by his own experience of transitional justice processes internationally.
How do you think CEDAW and General Recommendation 30 might make a difference to women post-conflict in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be enormously valuable, and I think it is a very useful recommendation for thinking about how we might begin to just reframe dealing with the past in Northern Ireland. Because first of all, there is what I started with, which is this unspoken gender piece. There's really very little public understanding or political acknowledgement of just how gendered the entire experience has been, the extent to which it is female relatives bearing the burden of a lack of accountability, the extent to which the absence of a reparations process has an adverse gendered effect because it is women who are paying the economic price as well, the socioeconomic price of a lack of reparations. So it would allow us to frame, I think, dealing with the past in a human rights appropriate way that acknowledges both the human rights obligations and the gender sensitive human rights obligations. It also gives us detail around sort of how to approach the document, things like even the basics, the documentation of gender harm. So making sure that the institutions that were provided for in the Stormont House Agreement, there's nothing in there that says that they can't be good gender sensitive processes. If there is a commitment to recognizing gender as a significant category of one's experience of the conflict and documenting harm accordingly, and then making recommendations around reparations that likewise acknowledge the gender specificity of one's experience of the conflict.
And very specifically in relation to conflict-related sexual abuse, how can Northern Ireland achieve post-conflict justice in this area, and why is it important?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have very because we have such, I mean, broadly speaking, because we have such poor documentation of gender harm beyond what's been done by a handful of academics, some women's organizations. What we don't even begin to have right now is really a comprehensive documentation of gender harm in the conflict. And to the extent that we have evidence of sexual violence, it is, again, very piecemeal. It tends to come from occasional newspaper reports. Some women's organizations will disclose their own experience of dealing with it, if in the right circumstances. I will say that the evidence is not that this was a defining feature of the conflict. And that in fact, if we really wanted to do justice to gender specificity of the conflict, I think it would be important that we start more broadly and ask about gender harm more broadly. But certainly that should be part of the tapestry. And one of the things that has come out of research that Aisling Swain and I did was the extent to which the criminal injuries compensation scheme structure actually had really occluded experience of sexual violence that was conflict related, that there were all sorts of structural factors with that scheme that meant that it was never brought into view. So there's some quite remedial stuff that we would need to do, I think, initially to even begin to get at that picture.
can I just ask you how and why it was occluded?
So part of it was this issue that I raised already, which was where you were living in the same household as the perpetrator, that you were not eligible for criminal injuries compensation. So that obviously, I mean, that excluded all manner of gender-based violence. But again, it was a feature of the conflict and the suspected paramilitary links of perpetrators and that sort of thing. So that was quite important. And more broadly, how the conflict, I think, interfaced negatively with this was the question around confidence in policing. So of course there is underreporting of sexual violence everywhere, but there were particular challenges around the lack of confidence in policing in Northern Ireland, the extent to which that was dictated as well by community affiliation. So, nationalists were less likely to report police violence or sexual violence. And the fact that the police also structurally deprioritized, quote unquote, interpersonal violence. And there was very much a sort of assumption that forms of violence wasn't about conflict, that it was about interpersonal or family-based violence.
And finally from me, before I hand over to the judges, looking at UN Security Council Resolution 1325, what steps do you think need to be taken to ensure increased participation and representation of women at all levels of decision making in the UK?
Yeah, so the CEDAW committee has been very helpful in its engagement around 1325, because it has specifically called on the UK to include Northern Ireland in its women, peace and security activities. And I really can't sort of overstate just how important and useful that is to call the UK to account for its obligations on women, peace and security within its own national borders is incredibly important, not just for Northern Ireland, but I think more broadly for the agenda. I mean, as a matter of priority, it really is about getting around this gender neutral policy making issue, because we can't even begin to get at the sorts of investigative work, the sort of documentation work that needs to be done around the conflict and accountability for that until we can get away from this gender neutral policy making issue.
Thank you very much.